Welcome to another deep dive. Today we're looking into Andrew Lavern Smith. I bet that name doesn't ring a bell for a lot of people.
Yeah, not exactly a household name.
But his story, it's significant.
Yeah,
And as we dig in, I think you'll see why.
it really is. And it brings up those big questions,
Yeah.
The ones about justice and crime and punishment.
Always a fun time.
Exactly. Those ones we're always wrestling with as a society.
Yeah, and this isn't just another random true crime story.
No.
This goes deeper. We're talking about a series of crimes that all happened in South Carolina back in the early 80s, all
Yep.
along, Interstate 85.
Right around there.
But here's the thing that makes this case stand out. Andrew Lavern Smith became like a landmark case in American legal history. He was the 500th person executed in the U.S. after they brought back the death penalty in 1976.
That's right. And that fact alone, regardless of how you feel about the death penalty, makes his case worth looking into.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
So you sent us a bunch of news articles and background info on Smith, and we're going to try to piece together his whole story.
It's like a puzzle
Yeah.
scattered across time.
All right, so let's rewind all the way back to the beginning. Smith was born in Anderson, South Carolina in 1960. Seems like he had a pretty normal childhood. Went to church, finished high school, even got certified in auto body repair.
Not exactly the typical death row inmate picture we have in our minds, right?
Right. It doesn't really fit the stereotype, does it?
No. It makes you think, sometimes the most shocking crimes, the ones that really get to you, are committed by people who blend right in.
Yeah, like you'd never suspect.
Totally.
Yeah.
We tend to think of criminals as these outliers, but that's often not the case at all.
Definitely makes you wonder what went wrong when things took a turn. His first serious crime, at least the first one we know about, happened in 1980. He attacked a convenience store clerk and tried to kill her.
Yeah, and it wasn't just any attack. He threw her off an overpass on I-85. It's almost unbelievable she survived.
I know. It's a miracle she's alive to tell the tale. That's a whole other story for another day. Then just a year later in 1981, there was another attack. This time the victim was a gas station attendant named David Evan Craig.
And that one was different. This time he used a gun, and sadly Craig didn't make it.
So did the police connect those two incidents right away? Because they both happened along I-85.
You'd think so, right? But it actually took them over a year to link Smith to that gas station murder. They finally got a match through ballistics testing from a gun violation chart he had.
Hold on. So they had evidence that could have pointed to him the whole time.
It's tough, right? It's not like they ignore evidence. It's just that ballistics testing, where they compare bullets and firearms. It's a specialized process.
Makes sense.
It takes time, expertise, and sometimes a little luck to find a match.
I guess investigations aren't always as simple as they seem on TV shows.
Nope.
But while they were waiting for that break, more crimes happened, right?
Sadly, yes. In 1982, a man named Neeraj J. Patel was found stabbed to death in a hotel room. Then, in 1983, an elderly couple, Christy and Corey Johnson, were found murdered in their home. Both of them stabbed multiple times.
So how did they finally connect Smith to all these crimes? Was it that gun violation?
Yeah, that gun charge was the key. Once they had Smith in custody for David Craig's murder, he confessed to something else. The murders of Christy and Corey Johnson.
Wow. He was just living his life working at a restaurant with all that on his shoulders. What was his motive for killing the Johnsons? Did he ever say?
He did. And it's chilling. He said he killed them because they wouldn't lend him their car.
That's just, it's hard to grasp. Such a small thing leading to such a horrific act. So they had him for the gas station attendant and the elderly couple. What about Neeraj Patel's murder? Did they ever tie him to that one?
They did. And again, ballistics testing was crucial. It seems he used the same weapon in several of the crimes.
So at this point, they had him connected to at least 3 murders. Did they charge him with everything?
They decided to focus on the Johnson murders first. It was a strategic move by the prosecutors, since he had already confessed. But then it gets even more complicated. Smith later claimed that his confession was forced by the police.
Trying to get his confession thrown out.
Well,
A classic legal move.
exactly. It's
Yeah.
a common defense strategy. But in Smith's case, the evidence against him was already pretty damning.
Makes you think about how vital forensic science is in these cases. Like without those ballistics tests, who knows how it would have played out.
Right. It's all about the details, the evidence.
So what happened at the trial for the Johnson murders?
Well, even though Smith tried to take back his confession, he was convicted in 1984 and sentenced to death. And because of that sentence, they didn't officially try him for the other murders, but those cases were basically considered closed.
So officially 2 murders, but suspected of at least 4, plus the attempted murder of the store clerk.
That's right. And we can't forget the woman who survived being thrown off the overpass. She later identified Smith as her attacker, too.
It's crazy how much violence can be connected to one person.
Hmm.
But there's still that other part of this story, right? The reason we're doing this deep dive in the first place, his execution being a landmark event.
Exactly. You see, when Smith was executed in 1998, it caused a huge debate nationwide because it marked the 500th execution in the U.S. since they brought back the death penalty.
That's a powerful number.
Yeah.
It makes you think about all the lives involved, not just Smith's, but all the victims and their families, too.
It really does. It's a stark reminder of the weight of these crimes and the questions surrounding the death penalty itself, the legal questions, the moral ones.
Okay, so we've got this guy from South Carolina, seemingly ordinary life, who gets caught up in this string of violent crimes and ends up becoming a symbol in this much bigger conversation. Where do we even start to unpack all of that?
Well, first, we need to understand the death penalty itself, right? What are the arguments for it and against it? How does it actually work? And how did Smith's case specifically become such a flashpoint in this ongoing discussion?
Sounds like we're about to dive into some heavy stuff.
We are, but they're important conversations to have, especially when we're talking about a system that has the power to end a life.
So we've laid out the facts of the case, the crimes, the trial, the sentence. But there's this whole other layer we need to look at, the death penalty itself. I mean, Smith's execution was this huge national event, right? The 500th one since it was brought back in 76. That's heady stuff.
It really is, and it's been debated so fiercely for decades. Strong emotions on both sides, for sure.
I get that. But before we even get into the arguments for and against it, maybe we can back up a little. What I always wonder in these cases is what makes someone go down this path. Smith had what seemed like a pretty normal upbringing. Did something happen along the way? Or was he just born evil? Like, where does it come from?
That's the million-dollar question, right? What makes a person capable of doing such awful things? Unfortunately, there's no easy answer. We don't have any of Smith's psychological records to look at. But we can think about some of the factors that often contribute to violent behavior.
Okay. Like what?
Yeah.
I'm always interested in that nature versus nurture debate.
Well, there are studies that show that things like abuse during childhood, neglect, exposure to violence even, substance abuse, these can all increase the risk of someone becoming violent later in life. And then you have things like personality disorders, antisocial personality disorder, for example, where people just don't have empathy. They don't care about the rights of others.
So it's more like they're predisposed to it, not a guarantee.
Right.
Right? Not everyone who has a rough childhood ends up being a murderer.
Exactly. It's not that direct. It's more like a recipe.
Okay.
You've got all these different ingredients, and depending on how they're combined, how much of each you use, you get a different outcome.
Interesting.
Some people who have those risk factors might become withdrawn,
Yeah.
anxious. Others might use their experiences to do something good,
I see what you mean. So I guess the question is, what was Smith's recipe? What were those specific things that pushed him towards that level of violence?
We might never fully understand. And it's important to remember that we're talking about human beings, not just case studies.
Okay.
We can never completely grasp the full complexity of a person.
True. It's easy to get lost in the facts and the legal stuff and forget that there are real people involved. Speaking of which, I know we need to get into the death penalty debate, but I think it's important to also acknowledge the victims in all of this.
Absolutely. We can't forget the human cost of Smith's actions. These weren't just names in a report. These were people with lives, families, dreams, all gone because of his choices.
Like David Evan Craig, the gas station attendant. I can't imagine the terror he felt in those last moments. And his family, losing a son, a brother, maybe a husband or a father. You can't measure that kind of loss.
And the Johnsons, that elderly couple brutally murdered in their own home, the place where they should have felt the safest. It's heartbreaking.
It's unimaginable the grief their loved ones must have felt, the anger. And we can't forget the woman who survived that attack in 1980, thrown off an overpass, left for dead. The scars she must carry, both physical and emotional. It's just awful.
It really is, but her strength is amazing. To be able to face her attacker like that, to identify him and help bring him to justice, it's a testament to how resilient people can be.
It makes you think about the ripple effect these crimes have. It's not just the victims themselves. It's their families, their friends, the whole community. It creates this fear, this distrust. It makes people feel vulnerable, and that can last for years.
It's a wound that takes time to heal. And for some, it might never fully heal.
Okay, so we've talked about the victims, the impact of Smith's crimes, and we've even touched on some of the things that might have contributed to his behavior. But I think it's time to dig into the heart of this whole deep dive, the death penalty itself. Like we said, Smith's case became this major point in the national debate around capital punishment. Why was that?
Well, it's partly because of the timing, right? His execution being the 500th since they reinstated it made it this symbolic event. It forced people to really confront this issue. But it also has to do with the crimes themselves and how the legal process went.
What do you mean?
Well, for one, Smith confessed to murdering the Johnsons at first, which made the prosecution's case a lot stronger. But then he claimed the confession was coerced, which always raises questions about how the police get confessions and whether those confessions can be trusted.
So that added another layer of complexity to it all. And probably made the debate even more heated.
Yeah, absolutely. And then there's the fact that he was only actually tried and convicted for 2 of the murders, even though he was suspected in several others.
Right, you talked about that before. So does that mean some people thought he didn't get enough punishment? Or maybe the opposite, that the death penalty was being used too much?
Probably both arguments were being made. And that's the core of the death penalty debate, isn't it? There's the idea of retribution, the eye for an eye thing. That some crimes are so bad that the only fair punishment is taking the perpetrator's life.
It's a harsh stance, I get it. But I can also see where they're coming from. If someone commits a brutal murder, especially of a child, it's hard not to feel like they deserve the worst possible punishment.
It's a very emotional response. And it's understandable. But that's one of the main criticisms of the death penalty, that it's based on emotions, not logic.
Okay, so let's talk about the arguments against the death penalty. Where do they start?
One of the biggest concerns is that you can't undo it. Once someone is executed, there's no going back, even if new evidence comes to light.
That's a scary thought. I know there have been people exonerated from death row sometimes after being locked up for decades.
Exactly. And that brings up one of the biggest criticisms of capital punishment, the risk of executing an innocent person. No justice system is perfect. There's always the chance of mistakes, bias, bad luck.
And in a case like that, a wrongful execution isn't something you can just apologize for and fix. It's a life taken for a crime they didn't even commit.
It's a terrifying thought, and for many people that possibility alone is enough to make them oppose the death penalty completely.
So what other things do people who are against the death penalty bring up?
There's the argument that it's discriminatory. There are studies that show that minorities, especially Black defendants, are more likely to be sentenced to death than white defendants, especially when the victim is white.
So you're saying there's racial bias involved?
It's a complicated issue, but the data seems to show that race is a factor in who gets the death penalty and who doesn't. And that brings up questions of fairness and equal justice for all.
Hard to argue with that. If the system isn't fair to everyone, then it's broken.
Right. And then there's the moral argument, which we mentioned before. A lot of people believe that it's just plain wrong for the state to take a life no matter what crime was committed. They say it devalues human life and goes against basic moral principles.
So we've got the risk of executing an innocent person, the possibility of racial bias, and the moral argument. Those are some heavy concerns. Anything else?
One more thing, the cost. It's actually more expensive to execute someone than to keep them in prison for life.
Really? How is that possible?
Well, the appeals process in death penalty cases is super long and complicated. All those legal fees add up.
So it's not even the most practical choice.
That's what a lot of people argue. They say the money could be better spent on preventing crime, supporting victims, or even just improving the justice system as a whole.
That's a lot to consider. All those arguments, the evidence, the ethics. It's a tough one. It seems like there's no easy answer. So what now? What does this all mean for the future of the death penalty, especially after a case like Andrew Lavern Smith's?
That is the question, isn't it? I think Smith's case and all the attention it got really forced people to think about their own beliefs about capital punishment, and that conversation is still happening today.
Okay, so we've talked about a lot, the crimes, the trial, the impact on the victims, even some of the psychology behind it all. But now we're at the main event, the death penalty itself.
It's a debate that never really goes away. And Smith's case, being that 500th execution, it really reignited things back in '98.
It feels like that debate's still going strong today. You mentioned there are really compelling arguments on both sides, so let's break them down. What are the main points that people who support the death penalty make?
Well, one of the big ones is that it acts as a deterrent. The thinking is that if someone knows they could face the ultimate punishment, they're less likely to commit a serious crime.
I could see the logic there. Make the punishment harsh enough and people won't risk it. But is there any proof that it actually works? Like, does the death penalty actually deter crime?
That's where it gets a bit messy. There have been so many studies on this, and the results are kind of all over the map. Some show a connection between the death penalty and lower crime rates, but others show no link at all.
So it's not a clear-cut answer either way.
Hmm.
What are some of the other arguments in favor of capital punishment?
Another big one is the idea that it brings closure to the families of victims. The thinking is that knowing the person who took their loved one's life has also been executed brings a sense of justice, helps them heal.
I can see how that would be powerful for some people. But on the other hand, couldn't it also keep those wounds open? Keep them focused on anger and revenge instead of moving on?
It's true. It's a very personal experience. What brings comfort to one person might cause more pain to another. There's no right way to grieve or cope with loss.
So deterrence and closure, those are two of the big ones. What else do death penalty supporters bring up?
The idea of retribution is a common one, the old eye for an eye concept. Some crimes are seen as so terrible, so fundamentally wrong that the only just punishment is death.
That's a pretty tough stance. I get the feeling behind it, though. If someone brutally murders another person, especially a child, it's hard not to feel like they deserve the most extreme punishment there is.
It's definitely an emotional response, and it's understandable, but that's one of the main criticisms of the death penalty, that it's driven by emotion rather than reason.
Okay, so let's flip the script and talk about the arguments against the death penalty. Where do those arguments start?
One of the biggest concerns is that it's irreversible. Once it's done, even if new evidence comes up later.
That's a frightening thought. I know there have been cases where people have been exonerated from death row sometimes after spending decades behind bars.
And that's a key criticism of the death penalty, the risk of executing an innocent person. No justice system is perfect. There's always room for human error bias, even just plain bad luck.
And if that happens, a wrongful execution isn't something you could just apologize for and fix. It's a life taken for something they didn't even do.
A terrifying thought. And for a lot of people, that possibility alone is enough to make them completely against the death penalty.
What are some of the other issues opponents raise?
There's a strong argument that it's discriminatory. Studies have shown that it's used more often against minorities, especially Black defendants, and that's especially true when the victim is white.
So there's racial bias involved.
It's complex, but the data does suggest that race is a factor in who receives a death sentence and who doesn't. It raises serious questions about fairness and equal justice.
That's hard to refute. If the system isn't fair to everyone, then it's inherently flawed.
And then there's the moral argument, which we've touched on. A lot of people believe it's just plain wrong for the state to take a life no matter what. They argue it devalues human life, goes against basic moral principles.
So we've got the risk of wrongful execution, the possibility of racial bias, and the moral argument. All very serious concerns. What else?
One more point, the cost. It actually costs more to execute someone than to imprison them for life.
Wait, really? How does that work?
The appeals process for death penalty cases is very long and very complex. All those legal fees really add up.
So it's not even the most efficient option from a purely financial standpoint.
That's what many opponents argue. They say that money would be better spent on preventing crime, helping victims, or just improving the justice system overall.
Wow. It's a lot to think about, all those arguments, the evidence, the ethical questions. It seems like there's no easy answer. So where do we go from here? What does all of this mean for the future of the death penalty, especially in light of a case like Andrew Lavern Smith's?
That's the million-dollar question. Smith's case, with all the attention it drew, really made people examine their own beliefs about the death penalty. And that's a conversation that's still going on.
So what does the future hold? Will the death penalty eventually disappear, or is it here to stay?
It's hard to say for sure. We have seen some states abolishing the death penalty or putting a hold on executions. Public support for it has also been going down.
But it's still legal in many states, and there are still plenty of people who firmly believe in it.
That's true. It's a complex issue tied up in our legal system, our morals, our views on crime and punishment. And I think cases like Smith's will continue to be discussed and debated for a long time to come.
You've definitely given us a lot to think about. From those chilling crimes along I-85 to the complexities of the death penalty debate, it's been quite a journey.
These are tough topics to grapple with, but it's important to do so even when there aren't any easy answers.
I totally agree.
Yeah.
And thanks to your expertise, I think our listeners have a much better understanding of those nuances and can form their own informed opinions.
That's what we're here for, to spark curiosity and encourage critical thinking.
And with that, I think we'll wrap up this deep dive. Thanks for joining us, and be sure to tune into our next episode, where we'll be tackling another fascinating and complex case. Until then, keep exploring, keep questioning, keep those minds engaged.